So good afternoon, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, depending on where you are. My name is Sawsan Abdulrahim. I'm a visiting fellow in the FXB Center for Health and Human Rights in the Palestine Program in Health and Human Rights. We're delighted today to host Dr. Jennifer Leaning in this conversation on children and war with a focus on Gaza. What I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce Dr. Jennifer Leaning first. She's going to talk for a little bit, and then we're going to have a Q&A and a discussion afterwards. So again, the topic is on children and war with a focus on Gaza. Just this morning, the death toll in Gaza numbered 33,843 individuals. And as you've been hearing on the news, almost 1/3, if not more, of those who are dead or injured are children. The injuries number 76,000 up to date, and the civilian deaths in Gaza, as of today, rival those we have witnessed in Darfur over the past couple of decades, which the U.S., by the way, called a genocide at that time. So we're going to have a talk about the impact of this war on children. And let me introduce Dr. Jennifer Leaning, who is a medical doctor and who served as the director of the Harvard FXB Center for Health and Human Rights between 2010 and 2018. She is presently a senior fellow at the FXB Center as well. Prior to 2010, Dr. Leaning served for 5 years as co-director of the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative. Her research interests focus on issues of public health and international law in response to war and disaster. She also has field experience in assessment issues of public health, human rights, and international humanitarian law in a range of crisis situations, including in the Middle East, by the way. She has published widely on these topics and submitted reports and policy briefings to U.S. and UN agencies, such as the International Criminal Court and major NGOs. And she has served on the boards of Physicians for Human Rights. Currently, she is a member of the steering committee of the Global Action Against Mass Atrocity Crimes. I can have a much longer introduction to Jennifer Leaning, but I just selected a few things that I thought would be most relevant for our talk today. So I'm going to share slides that Dr. Jennifer Leaning will go over, and we can go ahead and start. Go ahead, Dr. Leaning.
So thank you. Thank you very much for doing this. And it is a real pleasure to share the stage, so to speak, and the conversation with Sawsan, who is deeply steeped in these issues and has, of course, a much more grounded view of Palestine and the issues facing the population than I do. So I'll be speaking to some extent from my experience of doing investigations in Gaza and being in Gaza over the last 40 years, most recently in 2014, where I was part of a delegation from Physicians for Human Rights Israel to investigate the very bloody and swift Gaza 2014 war. And I have not been in the area since. So if we're going to talk about as you see in the title, dynamics, demographic impacts, and implications. It's focused now on the war and what we now see today as confronting both the survivors of Gaza and those who would seek to intervene and begin an end of the war and a resuscitation of the population and its landscape. Next slide, please.
Yes, I'm trying to. Yeah.
So if we think about it, I'm going to be talking about dynamics and demographic impacts, because this is a war. So the dynamics are, you have, as I said here, an extraordinarily sophisticated and heavily armed military against indisputably an unarmed and trapped civilian population. My figures may be different just slightly from what Sawsan said, but it's approximately 34,000 civilian deaths. That means deaths of people in Palestine, approximately 77,000 wounded as of today. Numbers are just coming in on the internet now, so there may be, but this is in the order of magnitude. The Israeli military deaths, which is what one always looks at when you're evolving a war, that is the civilians who have killed and the deaths of the military actors. And in this setting, the main military actor is the Israeli military. There are about 604 soldiers, reservists, and local security officers who have been killed, and 3,193 who have been wounded since October 7th. And the caveat here is that of them, as it's listed, 260 were killed and about 1,500 were wounded during the ground offensive. And the IDF also listed 41 soldiers killed due to friendly fire in Gaza and other military-related accidents. So the military has lost 604 to 650 soldiers, all told, and the Gaza Strip has lost approximately 34,000 deaths. So if you look at the deaths, the ratio of civilian to military deaths is about 130 to 1. In most wars where the ICRC has delivered a comment, and in the expectation of all wars under the Geneva Convention, the number of civilians killed as it relates to military opponents is notionally at 1 to 5, 1 to 10, 1 to 20, and then the international community begins to be concerned. The international community of the Red Cross does not go on record as saying what is an appropriate level of civilian to military casualties, because they don't want people to fight to that limit. But expressions of concern begin to ripple through the international community when you start seeing a ratio of 1 military death to 15 civilians, 1 military death to 25 civilians begins to raise high concern. What we're seeing here is well above thresholds of concern and, if not marked, frustration and dismay, 130 to 1. Next slide, please. So much of this is familiar to this audience. Skilled in land operations, the Israelis, air attack, using very sophisticated weapon systems. Much of this equipment has been received in terms of money to pay for it or actual structures themselves, weapons themselves from the United States. Israelis have full command of the air, the sea, and the ground terrain. The civilian population, estimated at 2.1 million and thought to be 2/3 women and children. No weapons. This civilian population has no weapons, forbidden and strictly enforced by the Israelis. And what we see on the demographics is that the Hamas operatives breached the barbed wire fencing, killed about 1,200 civilians, took approximately 250 hostages, and there were later reports that there were Israeli civilians who had been tortured or raped. And on October 8th, the IDF began its aerial bombardment of Gaza. Until this point, there's been intense bombardment, use of drones and missiles, deployment of tanks and armed forces within Gaza, and approximately 60% of all buildings in Gaza have been demolished, including mosques, churches, hospitals, museums, markets, shops, and civilian housing, all targets that are deemed unlawful in the Geneva Conventions. The Israelis have an argument about this, but we can talk about this later in the discussion. Next slide. So I've mentioned the number killed. It's also thought that about 30,000 are perhaps missing and perhaps buried in the rubble, for sure buried in the rubble. 2/3 of women and children. Israel has lost a small number compared to this, although high by Israeli standards in war. The hostages remaining are approximately 130, not all of them assumed to be alive. And Israel estimates that the deaths of the Hamas operatives might be around 10,000, but if you think 2/3 of the total casualties in Gaza have been women and children, which would mean that about male deaths of the civilians would be 11,000. It's hard to find another 11,000 dead in this total of dead. We can go over that again, but there are inconsistencies here, and the bottom line, though, is gross number of civilians have been killed. Next slide. This is, of course, a closely watched war and monitored. Unlike many of the wars of the late 20th and 21st centuries, it's known that children always die in war, but there are really few comparables to what's going on in Gaza from the mid-20th through the 21st century. I'm including from the beginning of World War II. So millions have died in armed conflict, from armed attack, forced flight, which is a death-dealing experience for children, and often ensuing famine. So this is not new. Many instances, contemporary assessments of the number of children who have died are very, very broad or did not take place at all, and may only show up in much later demographic assessments taken years after the war. Acute war deaths, that is the numbers, are always linked to the intensity of the war, that is the kinetic energy that's delivered to densely settled urban areas. This is where the high death rates occur. It's also related to the options for escape. And for Gaza, I would underscore, no escape is possible. It's a small territory, about 141 square miles, and the population is trapped within this kinetic targeting area. Longer-term deaths of populations in war, including children, always relate to the duration of the war, the experience of forced flight, exposure to elements, and famine. We're seeing this, except for the forced flight, in Gaza. Next slide, please. So the one-sided nature of this war really overwhelms ease of comparison. There are a number of recent conflicts, and I mentioned ones where I have been a human rights investigator at various phases of these conflicts, where civilians have been disproportionately killed and where they've been forced to die through direct attack, flight, and/or starvation. So in Syria, for instance, as of last estimates in 2018, the war was called over in 2020, but the last estimate was 500,000 killed, and that was when the UN said stop counting. We can't ascertain whether the further figures are accurate, but it was agreed that mainly civilians were in that death toll. Most of these, though, included fairly kinetic collisions between government troops and proxy nations like the USSR, like Russia, with control of the air, and state-sponsored and heavily armed groups on one side, that's the Syrian government side, and against armed groups and mobilized civilians on the other. So there were weapons on both sides, tactics on both sides, and flight was one of the principal modes of salvation for the civilian population until they got completely trapped as about 2020 and frozen in place. Kosovo and Bosnia are also important conflicts to think about. They're ethnic conflicts. Kosovo lasted for about a year and a half as a real armed conflict, insurgency, and Serbian attack. Bosnia went on for over 5 years. The populations in both countries were well over those in the Gaza Strip, and estimates of war and forced flight in Kosovo are well under the current totals in Gaza. Bosnian numbers are approximately 500 to 600,000 over longer years of war. Somalia and Sudan, gravely affected by famine, war, armed conflict in smaller skirmishes, and famine over the last 40 years, have experienced hundreds of thousands of deaths from direct attack and famine, and the cumulative totals may well be in the millions. One doesn't know. In many parts of Africa, census of populations have not been undertaken since the 1930s. And one could argue that those in Sudan, the casualties in the war, that the war was ethnically inflected and still is. All right. It overwhelms ease of comparison. Drop down to the last point. The exceptions include Rwanda and the Holocaust. These have been termed to be genocides. Next slide, please. In terms of mourning, which is present in the air now, as we've been seeing people suffer, and courageous journalists have interviewed people, and we've seen people on footage in real time in space in Gaza. It's a very important topic, and we may get into this, and with Sawsan's support, I'd be interested in talking about it in a discussion. But it's very difficult to engage in comparison. So the death of every child is a stark singularity to parents and family. Scholars may be moved to comment, perhaps accurately. There are going to be many contributions on this topic in the setting of Gaza. And so far, Palestinian experiences have been marginalized or dismissed as irrelevant by the dominant warring party, that is Israel. The outside world, to the extent that we can watch, has become increasingly concerned, if not galvanized, to protest and seek a ceasefire. And one observation from my human rights assessments in many of these circumstances and others is that outsiders may make generalizations that I know from being with families in these contexts are sometimes callous and often just wrong, about who's mourning, who's suffering, how to make sense of it. Next slide, please. So the humanitarian needs in Gaza are staggering, as I think all of you who are joining this webinar are aware. Severe and widespread child malnutrition, famine, now clearly evident in the north, although not explicitly documented by informed eyewitnesses. Untold numbers with amputations, serious wounds, and war-related illnesses, which, along with malnutrition, are going to speed from now on the deaths of those who are so affected. Thousands of widows and orphan children, easily more than 1 million displaced, and many have been displaced several times, as we all know from Israeli instructions to move south, to do more boom wars, to move to the sides, to move to the center. Completely demolished physical and social infrastructure, almost completely. There's a lot still standing in terms of, human life and some buildings. And although the aid that has now finally begun to flow again into Gaza is inadequate, and also our assessment of needs. So what is required, in addition to a ceasefire, is an organization to help coordinate assessment of needs and provision of assistance. And if space and time are given,
Recording in progress.
the reconstruction of healthcare and social services. And what we would like to argue is that UNRWA, the UN Relief and Works Agency for Palestine refugees in the Mideast, is the obvious, most important, and necessary organization to bring back into Gaza and to assist the international community in understanding what's happening, and in assessments of need and delivery of resources. Next step. Next slide, please. So that's the end of this slide. And so I think we're open for conversation, Sawsan.
Great. Thank you so much for this comprehensive and comparative presentation on the context in Gaza currently. You've covered so many issues, so many points that I had questions about, but we can absolutely continue to have a conversation about some of the things that you've mentioned. We generally think of children as the most vulnerable group that is affected by war. We even in situations where we do not have sympathy to victims, we cannot but have sympathy to children who have not who have not voted for political groups, who have not consented to war and not participated in war. Um, and what I wanted to talk about is more like the impact of the Israeli occupation, Israeli violence, and Israeli war on the children of Gaza specifically. As you've thank you so much for recommending that I read the recent article written by Rashid Khalidi, published in the Guardian, in which he argues that the current um, war and bombardment of Gaza is an episode in a long, 100 years of war against Palestinians. And if we just go back to the last 17 years and think about the siege and the blockade that Israel has instituted on Gaza and its impact on Palestinian children. If we can disentangle, or or if we can disentangle the long-standing impact, the impact of the long-standing siege and blockade on Gaza and its impact on children's well-being, nutrition, health, mental health, and the impact of the current violence, extreme violence that has been going on since October 7th. Can you please, from your experience, talk a little bit about the long-term impact of war on children? And as you've compared to Rwanda, to other wars, is it possible to compare and talk and basically situate the impact of the war in Gaza on children to what has been going on in recent history in terms of warfare?
Well, in terms of Rwanda, um, already understood as a genocide as it was unfolding. Um, there were not that many children who survived until there was an intervention, and then many could flee into Congo. I mean, it was an annihilation of communities, and children are easy targets, even if the main weapon is a machete, which was the case in Rwanda. But many of the Tutsis who tried to flee, and a lot of the other populations who tried to flee, moved into Democratic Republic of Congo. Some made it to Tanzania, but in the jungles and plains of Congo, particularly eastern DRC, it was evident that it was terribly difficult to have fled pregnant, to have fled with little children. The women often were pursued by zealous allies of the Tutsis in Congo and were killed. So there were many orphans, many young orphans who might be 2 or 3 years old and then brought back into Rwanda years after the genocide. And I remember seeing the children there when the International Committee of the Red Cross was visiting the nurseries where the children were first brought across the border from Congo back into Rwanda. So this is in eastern DRC and western Rwanda. And I'd seen it in Angola when I was looking at the landmine victims books by the international community, and particularly by the International Committee of the Red Cross. They had photographs. This is Angola now, another war. They had photographs of little black kids against a white sheet behind, sweaty and smiling because they were in a nursery or a kindergarten and had been fed because they were finally in a safe place, being told to smile for the camera. And you saw these shiny little baby black faces with white teeth reflected against the flash. Books that were, maybe 2.5, 3 feet by 18 feet, big books that you go through with perhaps 24 photographs on each side of the page, all color photographs, all these little faces. No way 2 or 3 years later for relatives to ever know who they were. And similarly, I saw this in the war in Rwanda. The same photographs, the same systems. There were relatives, Hutu relatives primarily, of those who had fled, and the children were being brought back 2 to 3 years after the genocide, and the same books were being used, going up and down Rwanda. Do you recognize these children? I don't know the outcome, the ICRC, in terms of connections. The ICRC is quiet on these issues, but there just the staggering need to reclaim and find these children who are survivors, probably both parents dead. And this was in a setting where there was, I'm talking about Rwanda, a pretty accomplished genocide, but people had fled. What we have here in Gaza is not the relentless face-to-face sheer horror of genocide between communities that live together, but a more distant affliction of massive force on a population that has long been considered inferior. So the dynamics are somewhat quite different. But in the times that I have been to Gaza, I have thought, because is it First Intifada, Second Intifada, Great March of, the Gaza 2014, earlier back in the late 1980s when I was there, I'd been to Gaza. And it was an amazingly interesting and beautiful place.
Mm.
And when I first went, there were still traces of the Egyptian culture that had actually been very dominant. And then every time I went back, I saw more buildings crushed, people wounded in the First and Second Intifada that were festering and dying because of abdominal wounds and massive pulverized leg injuries from the munitions that were used. No capacity to care for this in Gaza or actually in the West Bank. And over these years, the capacity of the Palestinians to actually care for people, let alone children, who have been wounded by these grievously powerful weapons, has been degraded. And now it's been, as we all know, severely degraded by the attacks, deliberate attacks on hospitals. So my concern certainly is related to the psychology of survivors, but it's also related to the enormous unmet needs of, by now, 40 years old, who were hurt in the First Intifada and the Second Intifada, who have, lingering abdominal wounds. Many of them will have died, but who have still massive disabilities from leg injuries or arm injuries or head injuries and are still alive. The burden of disability cumulatively that has been inflicted by these various attacks on the Palestinians, some of which they provoked, some of which where they were, engaged in killing. But this has been an overwhelming force applied over the last 30 years. And so we are not privy to how many of those old survivors are still now alive, because we haven't been able to go back and look at the situation in Gaza now. So this is where I'm speaking about the burden of war and wounded.
There's so much to unpack in what you said. One of the main things that in relationship to what you mentioned about your experience in Rwanda, what you've seen with the photos of the children in Rwanda, where in Palestine, I'm not sure whether it's because the children's small size saves them sometimes when a building collapses, where their parents die, but they survive. But as you know, as I'm sure many of you know, that there's like a new term that has been coined about Gaza, which is injured child, no surviving family, which Ghassan Abu Sitta has written about based on his experience of operating on so many children who have become orphans. They are the only survivors from their family from basically the collapse of a building. What I wanted, you also mentioned something related to people fleeing in different war experiences. And one of the the really contentious issues right now with respect to Palestinians, families, and children in Gaza is this tension between, Israel wants people to flee. So if you think about international law, in international law, people have the right to flee in situations of war and cross a border and seek asylum or safety in another country, in Egypt, in Israel, inside, 1948 Palestine, to seek safety from war. Yet there's also this feeling that this is what Israel wants. And so we need to do everything possible to protect people from this final decision to leave Gaza, because it's going to be another Nakba, another ethnic cleansing. There are people that I respect very much who have been calling for Egypt to open its border. From a human rights point of view, basically people need to flee in these situations. But I have a very ambivalent feeling about this. From a human rights perspective, yes, people need to be able to seek asylum and to be protected. In this situation in Palestine, this is what Israel wants. Another Nakba and another displacement of Palestinians, where they would never be allowed, most likely they would never be allowed to come back. So I just wanted to mention this. This is not specific to children, but I mean, the decision to leave also in many ways would be driven by, wanting to protect children. So people can remain steadfast and stay on their land. However, when they start to think about their children and their children's future, then the decision, about leaving becomes more appealing, I guess, children. In relationship to the well-being of children as well, I want us to come back. You've spoken about UNRWA and the attacks, the concerted attacks by Israel and by the US as well on UNRWA right now. Financially defunding UNRWA is the most effective weapon, I guess, that the US can use. And Israel has been lobbying for this for a long time, and accusing UNRWA of being a terrorist organization, when basically the underlying accusation is that UNRWA is keeping alive the plight of Palestinian refugees. And as long as UNRWA exists, this idea that Palestinians will remain refugees as long as there's a political solution, and as long as the right of return is realized. I would like your opinion as to the idea of calling these attacks on UNRWA as a war on children, namely because UNRWA's budget, the majority of UNRWA's budget goes to education and health. And if we think about education, schools, and the fact that UNRWA provides mostly primary health care to in the form of maternal and child health and other primary healthcare services. What do you think about this attempt to defund UNRWA and dissipate UNRWA as a war on children?
I would completely concur with that. I would completely, and I think the United States and the few others who remain, I think there may be 10 others who have still are not funding UNRWA, but they're the major donors. I think the United States is complicit in a war on children by not supporting UNRWA, and also by not, in many other ways, doing more to restrain Israel and do more in terms of calling out what's happening. But UNRWA, I'm not sure people who are not familiar with the Mideast or the situation in Israel and Palestine, I'm not sure they understand what a lifeline UNRWA has been over these last 40, 50 years. It's been a place where you can go and be yourself. And you are also interacting with a lot of Palestinians who are the staff of UNRWA. I mean, the national staff in UNRWA are many. But there is this leadership that is also from the international community, which is bestowed and sanctioned, supported by the UN, which is a protective umbrella over an operation that is quite intimate to Palestinian life. And I'm from the things that are not there now, nutrition for pregnant women, access to clean water, um, children's education, wound care, um, gauze and bandages will come in. I mean, there's so many things that UNRWA used to supply and support that are no longer there. Uh, I think people don't realize how, in some ways, desperately dependent um, the Gaza population was on UNRWA for life-saving daily sustenance. And they don't realize the extent to which poor people in the West Bank also relied on UNRWA. But UNRWA was is, and must still be very fundamental to the sustaining of society and life in Palestine.
Yes, yes. What about a question here from Dr. Amy Hagopian which I also had, relates to injuries and amputations. And what do we see as the long-term impact on Palestinian children who have suffered amputations? I mean, this is one of the stark images that we saw on social media. Not sure if this was on any mainstream news channels, but this doctors amputating children's limbs in order to save their lives, in some cases without using anesthesia because of the limited supply of limited medical supplies. There have been a few articles that written about disability and this idea of disabling the Palestinian body as disabling the nation as well, and breaking the nation. And for anyone who writes about or thinks about public health through a life course lens, this idea that, when a child is disabled during war, we cannot just think about the short-term impact. We need to think about the long-term. And here, disability can be physical, but also the trauma, the psychological trauma. One of the attendees raised a question about how children begin to understand the impact of war at the age of 7. And we have such a large proportion of children who are impacted by Israel's war in Gaza who are below age 7. What would be the long-term impact of what's going on right now on children as they grow up in life in Gaza?
Well, I'm not a developmental child psychologist or psychiatrist, but I would say from my experience and from what I've read, the children over 7, many of whom in Gaza, have been grievously wounded with amputations and probably to some extent some brain injury because of the percussion, or abdominal wounds with tubes and slow healing. They probably have gone through the worst of both experiences, understanding a war in terms of its animus, the hatred, the inconceivability of it. How do you understand the inconceivability of something? But you recognize it at least. They've gone through that and then also are still burdened by wounds. The younger children experience of intense pain, which is what these children experience that you're describing, who had to have limbs amputated without anesthesia. I don't know how a neurologist would assess that, or a clinical psychiatrist, but I think that feelings of prolonged intense pain, as well as deprivation, that is not near the mother, not near comfort, not having it be released, and then you're okay in a warm and fuzzy place, and drinking good water and being cradled in her arms. Long pain and isolation not comfort, can only be an imprinting experience. And I don't know enough to say how it will unfold in terms of future rage, or future inability to connect to people. So it's going to go one way or the other. And there will be a need to deal with children who are some ways out of control and children who can't relate. I mean, this is happening at an extremely vulnerable time in terms of forming attachments to other people. So full stop. That's what I think. It's terrible.
Yes.
The other point that relates to the longer term disability, if you're thinking only of lower limbs, getting around on crutches, let alone having the access to an artificial limb, getting along on crutches in a sandy, uneven environment is extremely tiring. I remember a war correspondent I saw, American, in Somalia, in Mogadishu, and during the war there. And he may have died, very well known. I wish I could remember his name, John something. But anyway, he had had a double amputation, not from war, but from something else. And he was there in a wheelchair, trying to get around in the sand and interview people and go up and down the beach or the sandy streets of Mogadishu when the ceasefire was in effect. And he said he wrote an essay in the New Yorker about how extraordinarily exhausting it was to try to be in a wheelchair and not on the relatively concrete, smooth steps of New York City, which was sort of his normal beat, So outsiders don't understand how many of these wars, which occur in areas of uneven ground, let's put it that way, are really difficult to navigate around in any sort of peace or efficiency once you've had one, let alone a bilateral leg amputation, or you've had a leg taken and then an arm, which is just extraordinarily disabling in terms of stability and capacity to get on with your life. So these are, if the person survives, the child or the young adult survives, these are going to be enormous burdens of care for the remaining Palestinian population. And the solidarity, coming back to your earlier point about Egypt, the solidarity with land and the notion of this being our land, that is Palestinian people, is in my view, I compare it, but this may be inappropriate, but I compare it to the attachment one has to a child. I don't have a child. I'm attached to certain landscapes, very attached. And I know from reading Raja Shahada's works, Palestinian Walks and others, things that he's written, about how there's such an enormous ache and loss when he sees how Palestine, not Gaza, but Palestine, has been destroyed from the time when he was a boy. And I think that, we all understand about ecological loss now more, throughout the world in terms of climate change. But for Palestine, land ecological loss is part of their sense of life forward. And I think we must respect that extremely deeply.
Yes, I think land is in a lot of the Arabic literature and Palestinian literature is framed as the mother. So it's interesting that you say it's the attachment to the land is like attachment to a child, to one's child. There's a point that I think is important to talk about in the last few minutes or so, relates to the dehumanization of Palestinians through this discourse about Palestinians not grieving their children or not grieving. And in some ways, maybe, Palestinians themselves have perpetuated this notion by saying that, a mother whose child is killed by Israel, should celebrate or should, show strength rather than grief. So this idea that Palestinians do not mourn their dead or do not mourn their children the way Israelis or other people around the world mourn. How does this, and I know you said you're not a psychologist, but how do you think, if you have any thoughts about how this suppression of mourning serves to protect people? What does it mean when mothers suppress mourning their children that they've raised for 20 years, 25 years, and receive news that their child has been killed, their daughter has been killed? Yeah.
Well, I believe that just from a human standpoint and from standpoint of a medical doctor who is taking care of a number of people through my time in medicine, in an emergency department, that suppression of grief is a very, very dangerous thing to one's ongoing future health in terms of lifestyle, eh, focus on what comes next in terms of your own life, a sense of life stopping because you're not grieving and trying to get through it, life stopping. And it's not, in a peacetime society, we try to have people work through their grief, come to terms with it over years, have metabolized it over and over again. It's not easy. And it always mars them. The death of a close loved one always mars them. They'd be the first to say it, but so would their families or their healthcare providers. It sometimes makes them much more humane because they understand the grief of others. Sometimes they are more reserved. But in any case, inevitably for human beings, a loss is a loss with enormous consequences. And so I feel that the culture of Palestinian martyrdom and Palestinian attachment to the land and Palestinian, resistance to expulsion, is one that protects women and also men who mourn also, from falling apart in grief. But it is not the only thing that is going on.
Yeah. I want to ask you a question by Dr. Mary Bassett. In the face of so much destruction and violence, can you talk about how you remain hopeful? Having been in the presence of war crimes for so many years, having witnessed so many and written about so many different cases of warfare and their impact on civilian populations, their impact on children, and as you witness what's going on in Gaza right now, and how do you remain hopeful? Yeah.
Well, it would be unseemly if I didn't stay hopeful, given how many people who are persisting through these horrors and do come out on the other side and are trying to continue with their lives and their society. I remember vividly a young man, he probably was somewhere between 17 and 19, whom I met on the western border of Somalia with Kenya. This is during the 1991-93 war in Mogadishu. And I was there at the camp that was just being set up, that is then turned into one of the biggest world's refugee camps in the world on the Kenya-Somali border. And it's been a troublesome place. But they were just setting up there, and I was there on that western border. MSF was just uncrating its tents. And the nurses were there setting up rooms and barracks for people who were just coming, wounded and famined, starved by famine, who'd walked across the whole breadth of Somalia to reach the Kenya border and escape what was going on. They walked from the sea at Mogadishu all the way across to the Kenya border. And the nurses said, this young man arrived today. We are just starting to assess what he needs. He's agreed to be interviewed. Would you be willing to talk to him? So I came into the room. He was standing with a sort of large white towel wrapped several times around his waist. Torso obviously emaciated, legs so thin, and looked at me with his face without any facial fat at all, but you could see the muscles move. He looked at me with these bright eyes, standing straight, which, you know, when people are very hungry, it takes energy to stand straight. Standing straight and looking at me, and I asked him through translation, how amazing it is that you survived. And he said, I felt I had no choice because so many people around me were dying. I asked him if I could take a picture. I still have a photograph of him. I rarely show it in class because it is so stark and it takes a long time to prepare the students for it and then to deal with the aftermath of it. But survival is everything possible. So I retain, I'm not sure it's a hope, but it's a doggedness to keep going and trying to have the world understand the suffering and to be in a place where I can discuss it with some background information.
So on that note, what do you think about the response by the medical community in the US? And what kind of conversations have you been having um, I mean, academics, medical doctors who are not speaking out or who are not taking a position um, uh, in terms of what's going on in Gaza right now? I know that some of my colleagues here are having a very hard time
Yes.
professionally and personally communicating with their colleagues who have not stood on the right side with respect to the atrocities that are going on in Gaza.
Mhm. I share this sense of dismay. Um, I'm on the advisory board of Physicians for Human Rights. I worked with them and was on the board and did investigations for them for 20, 25 years. And now I'm on the advisory board. Um, uh, there was not an immediate statement that came out of PHR about the war in Gaza, even though PHR has worked with PHR Israel for decades. And everything I did in Israel as a human rights investigator was done with PHR US. And I wrote after about a week to the director. And I apparently was not the only one on the advisory board who wrote saying there should be a statement. And the relatively new director, a great guy with a lot of international experience, not American, American citizen maybe, but not born and brought up here. He said, I've just written a statement and I've just gotten approved by our staff and our board, and here it is. And he sent it, within 5 minutes. And it was extraordinarily good. And it did not get much coverage. But it at least was Physicians for Human Rights came out with great clarity and analysis about what was going on. And they pulled no punches. But I would say that the American community, the American elite, American business community, the American elite, and physicians, and not so much nurses, but physicians are have not really looked at what has been going on in Israel or in Palestine in any depth for any length of time. And many, as tourists or as religious travelers, have gone to Israel and found it wonderful at various times and places. And so they are caught up in sort of a Joe Biden way of looking at Israel, Jews and non-Jews. And it's time for them to see more clearly. The world has changed. It's not the 1970s. It's not the 1940s. It's now. And Israel is a changed place.
Maybe from the point of view of American tourists, from the point of view of Palestinians, Israel has been consistently the way it is, I think, in terms of their policies and
From
their,
1948, exactly.
yes,
So
absolutely.
I respect that.
Yeah. But thank you so much. This has been a really great conversation. And I want to thank all the people who joined us. And thank you so much, Jennifer, for your wisdom and for linking things together. It's really, I mean, sometimes we watch the news in the past 6 months or so, and we're focused on Gaza, but it's really important to connect with other genocides, other wars, other violence inflicted on children in other parts of the world. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much for
Thanks.
joining me on this.
Yes,
Thank you very much.
thanks. Okay, goodbye.
Bye.